Well, welcome back to 4550 RPM, remembering past musos born in the 40s and the 50s. I'm your host GK, and this is episode 8, and we'll be offering a short overview of the extraordinary story of Sixto Rodruguez, better known by his stage name Rodruguez. Born 10 July 1942 in Detroit, Michigan, Rodruguez was virtually unknown in his home country of the USA, but a huge, almost cult-like following in both South Africa and Australia. Now, some of what I'm going to discuss here is drawn from the award-winning 2012 documentary Searching for Sugar Man, which, quote, Searching for Sugar Man is a 2012 documentary film about a South African cultural phenomenon, written and directed by Malik Benjalul, which details the efforts in the late 1990s of two Cape Town fans, Stephen Sugar Siegerman and Craig Bartholomew Stradom, to find out whether the rumoured death of American musician Sixto Rodruguez was true, and if not, to discover what had become of him. Rodriguez's music, which had never achieved success in his home country of the United States, had become very popular in South Africa, although little was known about him there, unquote. So that's from Searching for Sugar Man documentary at Wikipedia. I strongly suggest you watch the documentary as it outlines Rodriguez's story brilliantly, but mostly from a South African angle. And the makers make little reference to how big he was here in Australia too. But I'm getting ahead of the story here, so let's just go back to a little bit of history here. Rodruguez released 2 albums. First, the absolutely brilliant Cold Fact in 1970, and Coming From Reality in 1971, both on the Sussex label in the USA. The Cold Fact album is one of those albums where every tune is a gem. Now, according to the head of Sussex Records, who appeared in the aforementioned documentary, it sold around 6 copies in the USA. I mean, I think that's a use of the hyperbole, but, the point is it sold very little, close to none. But the album in South Africa, over a number of free releases by different record labels, sold around 500,000 copies, and I think that's gone on to be about 5 million by now. Okay, so, you've got, on the one hand, in the USA, we've got 6 copies, but in South Africa, we've got 6 million. So what's going on here? And that's the point of this documentary, and it really is a part of his story. Like they say in the film, in South Africa, Rodriguez was actually bigger than Elvis. Now, Cold Fact, the album, is a mix of folk rock and psych rock, and I think it's got, gritty inner city storytelling lyrics, which is really, really what attracts me to it. The music is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but the songs tell such great, gritty, what am I trying to say here? The lyrics of the songs tell such great stories. And I'm sure much of it comes from Rodriguez's experience growing up in inner city Detroit. But I'm probably going to say it a couple of times in this episode, and I'm sorry about that, but you just have to go and listen to Cold Fact. Go and buy it and listen to it, or go on to YouTube and have a listen, because the lyrics are at the same time gritty, but very empathetic. Let's move on a little bit. Now, in the documentary, they suggest that the album Cold Fact, with its anti-establishment attitude, became the soundtrack to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and I think especially amongst the Afrikaans community of that era. So if you think about that, the anti-apartheid movement, and this is kind of their soundtrack to that time and that period, you can see why Rodriguez may have been bigger than Elvis there. Now, the fact that he was bigger than Elvis, coincidentally, with that, was this point. No one knew much about him. Now, you got to remember, this was before the internet and during the apartheid era in South Africa, so, like they were saying, there wasn't a whole lot of communication with the outside world. I don't know, I wasn't there, but this is what they were saying. And add to that, there was these rumours that because his career wasn't so successful in his home country, that he had committed suicide. And I think one of the rumours said that he'd shot himself on stage, or that he'd set himself on fire and killed himself, or something like this. Obviously, these rumours proved to be false, because when the guys from South Africa finally tracked him down, he was alive and well. Surprise, surprise. Now, the story goes on to say that in the 90s he eventually did get to tour South Africa to sold-out shows. And I think him and his family were very surprised just to see how popular he was there. Because beforehand they had no idea how big he was there. So you got these two things going along in parallel. He's absolutely huge in South Africa. And in the United States, him and his family had no idea that this was happening. Add to that in South Africa, they knew no information about him, right? So I think this is a great story. And it does have its parallels here in Australia a little bit, which I'll go into in a second, but just a little bit. Now, the filmmakers do a great job showing how, like I just said, he had no idea how big he was in South Africa, and the fact that people knew so little about him. However, what is not shown in the film is just how big he was here in Australia and in New Zealand. And yes, I struggled myself to find out much info about him in the pre-internet era, except for this one experience of mine that I had, because I had the album, and I don't know how many times I could flick over and read the information on the album, but there's just no information there that says who he is and what he's doing currently and things like that. So anyway, Rodruguez toured Australia in 1979 and in 1981. So well before he went to South Africa, right? Our South Africa cousins, the point I'm making here is they just didn't mention Australia, and he was huge here. So he toured here in 1979 and 1981. And in 1981, on that tour, I was planning to go and see him. He was playing in Lismore in New South Wales. But on the same night, I actually had a gig in Ballina, which is, about 30 minutes down the road or so. And so I didn't get to see his show. Now, an acquaintance of mine did make the Lismore gig. And that night, when we met later on, he told me the following story. He said that Rodruguez appeared on stage with his guitar and a bass player. Now, the first note that the bass player played, and it was probably the intro to I Wonder, the bass amp exploded and he left the stage, and Rodruguez had to carry the night alone. Now, this acquaintance of mine also said that it wasn't the best concert that he'd ever seen, right, that he'd ever been to. Now, remember, this report is second-hand. It's not from me. And I repeat it here just to highlight the point that we knew about him here in Australia, and he'd come here before he'd ever gone to South Africa. And he'd been down there a couple of times. Now, he also came back a couple more times in the 2000s. I think it was to the East Coast Blues Festival at Byron Bay, because I was planning to go to one of those, but it got well and truly rained out. Coincidentally, Byron Bay, not far from Ballina and Lismore again. And in those shows, man, he was really good, and he proved to be so popular that they had to have him come back again. So he came back again to Australia a couple more times. So I know I'm raving here a bit, but I love this guy. I love his story. And for me, the almost that happened for me personally, I won't say a bad taste in my mouth, because that's not the right idiom, but it just makes me feel a bit sad that I didn't get to see him when I had the chance, let's say, and just leave it at that. Okay, so let's leave the Southern Hemisphere for now and go back to the United States. So after his initial album releases, which found little success over there, Rodruguez worked in Detroit. Now, I think he worked at Chrysler for a while, and he did a lot of hard graft in the construction industry. If you watch that documentary, some of his ex-co-workers talk about how much of a hard worker he was. And he also did a lot of work for and with the people of inner city Detroit. He did run for local elections in an attempt to better the lives of the people in his community. And so, he was that sort of a guy, and that comes across in the lyrics, In fact, I actually thought, one of the rumours I'd heard, not about him dying, but I heard that he was a social worker, right? And, an inner city social worker, and these were stories from, his clients. That's the rumour that I'd heard. And I can't remember, because it's like 40 years ago that I heard that. I don't know where I got it from, but it's just a rumour. There's no truth that I could find to that. But to the success of the documentary Searching for Sugar Man, he started to get some recognition, which he should have, in his own country. And he got to play some live concerts there. He appeared on TV. I think they did an episode of him on 60 Minutes because the story is just so beautiful. And it is a beautiful story about how fame finally came to someone who deserved it. And by all reports, he was humble to the end. What a nice guy. I'll finish up here now. It's been a bit of a rave and a bit of a rant. I'm very passionate about this stuff, but do yourself a favour. Go and listen to Cold Fact. He pulls no punches in his lyrics, but it also shows his compassion for the lost souls who live in a city setting. There are a few albums for you to get hold of or to listen to. The initial release in 1970, Cold Fact, and the follow-up album in 1971, Coming From Reality. You should really try and get those two. He does have a number of compilation albums out there. Over different time periods and by different record companies, even in different countries. And 3 great live albums that I'm going to recommend you get hold of. 2 of them are Australian releases, and one's a South African one, surprise, surprise. So we have 1981, Rodruguez Live, recorded live at the Regent Theatre in Sydney, Australia. It was recorded on 17th and 18th of March 1979. You can go onto YouTube and have a quick listen, but you can tell it's good stuff. And it's nothing like the one my acquaintance had described to me about his experience with Rodruguez in Lismore in 1981. And then, did I say that one was released in 81 but was recorded in 79? I think I did. All right. And then we have Live Fact. The album's just called Live Fact. It's a South African release from 1998. And then we've got the 2016 release, Rodruguez Rocks, live in Australia. So there's plenty out there for you to sink your teeth into. You got the initial studio releases, those 3 live ones I've suggested, and a number of compilations albums out there. So if you haven't heard of him and you haven't had a listen, you've really got to do yourself a favour and go back and have a listen, because you'll see the comparisons there with, let's say, Bob Dylan, Neil Young. I nearly said, but he's better than those guys, but I think I'll just edit that bit out because I don't know if that's fair. It's just my opinion. All right. This has been episode 8 of 4550 RPM. It's dedicated to Sixto Rodruguez, who's born July 10, 1942 and sadly passed away August 8, 2023. And remember, as ever, I'm your host GK, and until next time, take care of yourself.